This series has explained the long-term American plan to seize control of Europe by absorbing all nations into NATO. This was very successful after the Cold War ended, but taking control of Russia and its sister nation of Ukraine was complex. Billions of dollars were spent to gain political control of Ukraine, but this failed to convince most Ukrainians to support joining NATO. The solid Ukrainian regions in the west were supportive, but the Russian-speaking regions in the east opposed this effort, as shown in this map of the results of Ukraine's 2010 presidential election. Viktor Yanukovych was elected after promising Ukraine would remain neutral and not join NATO. As a result, the CIA organized a coup to overthrow his democratic government by funding and arming far-right Ukrainian nationalists. Journalist Aaron Matei provides insight.
After months of protests in the Maidan in Ukraine in 2013, 2014, by the way, what started out, a large part of those protests were legitimate. They were protesting a corrupt government, Yanukovych, and they were calling for democratic reforms. There's a lot to admire about what they did. But the problem is, as happens often, those protests got co-opted by far-right Nazi forces who turned it into a bid for violent regime change. And the zenith of that was when, to resolve the Maidan protest, to resolve the crisis, there was a negotiated settlement reached, brokered by European countries, in which the president, Yanukovych, would agree to new elections very, very soon and have curtailed powers. That was agreed with the opposition. The opposition leaders went back to the Maidan and met with the far-right leaders who told them, what the hell are you doing? We're not going to make an agreement with this guy. We want him out. And shortly after that, there was, as the spokesperson mentioned, a massacre of protests in Maidan. Snipers killing people, a lot of people. It was blamed on the Yanukovych government. And that then led to a series of more violent action that basically forced Yanukovych to flee. And that agreement that would have resolved this crisis was killed. The U.S., by the way, cheered when Yanukovych fled. It turns out there's been research done by a political scientist, Ukrainian, at the University of Ottawa, named Ivan Kachanovsky, based on forensic evidence, videos, speaking to witnesses, that shows pretty conclusively, and I'll tweet this out after this interview, that the shooting of these Maidan protesters came from a Maidan far-right fascist-controlled area, that they were the ones killing their own people to try to spark an event that could lead to a violent overthrow of the government, and that's exactly what happened.
This coup instantly led to a civil war as millions of Ukrainians began protests. Ukrainians who protested the CIA coup in Kiev were called pro-Russian by the Western media. A key element for a successful coup is that new leaders assure citizens and businessmen that nothing will radically change until full control has been established throughout the nation. This did not occur as a small political party called the Right Sector took control in the capital of Kiev, as explained by two American professors.
Spoke to Russia scholar Stephen Cohen, who said Ukraine is essentially two different countries.
Ukraine is splitting apart down the middle because Ukraine is not one country, contrary to what the American media, which speaks about the Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. Historically, ethnically, religiously, culturally, politically, economically, it's two countries. One half wants to stay close to Russia, the other wants to go west. We now have reliable reports that the anti-government forces in the streets, and there's some very nasty people among them, are seizing weapons in Western Ukrainian military bases. So we have clearly the possibility of a civil war.
That's Stephen Cohen. Nikolai Petro, would you agree?
Professor Cohen is right that there are very serious differences between the regions, and they go deep to the historical memory of not just what World War II was about, but what the end of the Russian Empire was about. what the Austrian-Hungarian Empire and Poland, the parts of Ukraine that were under it, were about. Professor Snyder is, however, also correct on the fact that much of the country does not want to dissolve. There is a commitment to being Ukrainian, and it would be indeed to everyone's advantage here if the country, if the parliament really did reach out to the segments of the population that are not, that have been effectively disenfranchised by the last coup. And however, I would tend to disagree, because the first steps within 24 hours that they've taken are exactly the opposite. Let me give you an example. The repeal of the law allowing Russian to be used locally, that's the main irritant in East-West relations within the Ukraine. The introduction of a resolution to outlaw the Communist Party of the Ukraine, which effectively is the only remaining opposition party in parliament. The consolidation of the powers of the Speaker of the Parliament and the acting president in a single individual, giving him greater powers than allowed under any Ukrainian constitution. Of course, the call for the arrest of the president. Now we have effectively a parliament that rules without any representation from the majority party, since most of the deputies of the east and the south of the country are afraid to set foot in parliament. Meanwhile, all across the country, headquarters of parties are being sacked by their opponents. This is the stage which we have for the elections for May 25th. Will they be fair? There's no money, according to the acting president and speaker. Vigilante militias routinely attack and disperse public gatherings they disapprove of. News broadcasts. Yesterday, Inter was interrupted by forces claiming to speak for the people. What do you think?
This new CAA-organized government freed political allies from prison. It passed a law providing pensions for Ukrainians who had fought alongside the Germans in World War II, and tore down statues of Soviet heroes who defended Ukraine in World War II. CAA-armed Ukrainian nationalists began a reign of terror throughout Ukraine against political opponents and independent media. Aaron Matei provides more details.
By the way, what prompted them to take up arms and to refuse to be a part of a coup regime-led Ukraine? It wasn't just the coup. Shortly after the coup, a few months later, something happened in a town called Odessa in Ukraine, where there was a massacre. Russian speakers were burned alive by fascists, burned alive, dozens of them inside a building. Those are unworthy victims. We're not allowed to talk about them or acknowledge their concerns. But that was a huge factor in leading to the Russian-speaking region in the Donbass to take up arms and to not want to be a part of a coup-led Ukraine. And that's what sparked this fighting for so long.
A major goal of the NATO annexation of Ukraine was to take control of its province of Crimea. This is a strategic peninsula that Russia's Catherine the Great had purchased from the Ottomans in 1783. Tens of thousands of Russians died during World War II defending Crimea. It was the location of the famous Yalta Conference in 1945. Crimea was part of Russia for almost 2 centuries until it was administratively attached to Ukraine in 1954 by Soviet Premier Khrushchev, a Ukrainian, to promote Soviet solidarity. Russians are still the majority people in Crimea, and Russian is the common language. But they were not consulted, and nothing changed since they were still ruled by Moscow. Crimea is home to Russia's Black Sea Fleet, based at the large naval base at Sevastopol, because of a 1997 treaty with Ukraine that also allowed 25,000 Russian troops to remain to protect Crimea. After the Soviet Union disbanded, Crimeans were subtly ruled by Ukrainians in Kiev, even though only 16% of its population are Ukrainian. 68% of Crimeans are ethnic Russians, and Russian is a common language. They were uncomfortable as part of Ukraine, but remained an independent republic and felt safe with some 25,000 Russian servicemen at their Sevastopol naval base. In early 2014, An American coup in Kiev installed Ukrainian nationalists in power who sought to ethnically cleanse Ukraine. On March 11, 2014, Crimea's parliament voted to leave Ukraine with 78 in favor and 22 against. Crimea organized a referendum asking its citizens if they preferred to remain part of Ukraine or rejoin Russia. The outcome was certain based on polls conducted in past years. Crimeans would vote to rejoin Russia because they never wanted to be part of Ukraine. The Ukrainian army had a few small outposts in Crimea, and local leaders feared interference. They asked Russia to ensure these soldiers would not interfere in the voting. A few hundred Russian soldiers without insignia surrounded these small bases and asked the few soldiers and civilian employees at each base if they would like to join the Russian military or be transported to Ukraine. Half chose to join Russia, while the others were peacefully evacuated to Ukraine. This was spun as a Russian invasion of Ukraine by little green men and became a propaganda talking point by hysterical American officials warning of Russian aggression, like State Department spokesman Admiral John Kirby.
NATO has moved closer to Russia rather than Russia moving closer to NATO. Is that not an accurate way to look at this?
I think that's the way President Putin probably looks at it. It's certainly not the way that we look at it.
You don't think that NATO has expanded eastward toward Russia?
NATO has expanded,
Okay.
and the expansion has been a good thing for...
So the reason that the Russian army is at NATO's doorstep is not the fault of the Russian army, it's not the Russian army that's done it. It's NATO has moved closer to, moved
I'm pretty
east.
sure it wasn't NATO who was ordering, upwards of 15 battalion tactical groups to within 10 kilometers of the border with Ukraine. And I'm pretty sure it wasn't NATO who put little green men inside Ukraine to destabilize eastern
I'm
cities.
pretty sure that Ukraine is not a member of NATO. So unless that's changed,
It's not
Okay.
changed, but I'm
So,
pretty sure the movement by Russia is
has
Russia's
NATO,
decision.
if NATO has moved east, the reason that the Russian army is closer or on NATO's doorstep is because NATO moved, not
NATO
because
is not an anti-Russia alliance. NATO is a security alliance.
Unfortunately, for 50 years, it was an anti-Soviet alliance. So
Where's
do you
the
not
Soviet
understand
Union
it? So do you not understand how, or can you not even see how the Russians would perceive it as a threat? And the fact
Russia accepted a request by the people of Crimea to rejoin Russia after 97% voted in favor. This vote was denounced as illegal by NATO nations and the European Union. They claimed widespread fraud existed because no official international observers were sent. This is because they refused invitations, as Crimeans voted overwhelmingly to rejoin Russia. Even most non-Russians in Crimea voted to rejoin Russia because Ukraine is the most corrupt and poorest nation in Europe, while Russia has vast natural resources and is more advanced. The Russian reannexation of Crimea was desired by the vast majority of its citizens, and this was no surprise based on past polls. The United States denounced this democracy, saying it violated international law. Crimea stated this was legal and cited the Kosovo precedent, referring to the 2008 Declaration of Independence by the Serbian province of Kosovo that was organized by the United States and backed by American combat troops in Kosovo. This was declared valid by the UN International Court of Justice in 2010, which later declared this ruling didn't apply to Crimea. As coup leaders in Kiev began to exert control over all of Ukraine and attack protesters, many soldiers deserted from the Ukrainian army and formed militias to protect their homeland. 2 Ukrainian provinces in the east held referendums and voted for independence. This Donbass region is mostly ethnic Russian and had voted heavily in favor of Ukraine's ousted president. Russia had no troops in the Donbass, and Russian President Putin refused requests to send Russian troops to help defend the Donbass. Russia did not want to rule Ukraine, which is why it allowed it to become independent. The small Ukrainian army was ordered east to crush this rebellion. This was called an anti-terrorist operation. It captured half the Donbass, but fighting led to a stalemate. Russia claimed it didn't support the rebellion, but there was much evidence that military equipment was provided, while thousands of volunteers from Russia arrived to fight. There were even reports of artillery support fired from Russia, and some clashes along the border with Russian units. The Russian military was not ready to fight a major war, and President Putin thought he could work with European leaders to maintain friendly relations with the West and protect ethnic Russians in the Donbass. Germany, France, Ukraine, and Russia held talks and signed the Minsk Accords to end the fighting. Combatants would withdraw to create a large buffer zone, while the two Donbass provinces gained de facto independence, yet officially remained part of Ukraine. American neocons were thrilled that they had restarted the Cold War, while their media outlets constantly denounced a Russian invasion of Ukraine. Military spending soared in the United States and NATO. However, deranged warmongers like John McCain were furious the fighting had ended with Russia in control of Crimea.
So we have no military obligation here to defend Ukraine. And do you think there is a military option, even if we had an obligation?
I'd love to tell you that there is, Andrea, but frankly, I do not see it. I'm glad to see our U.S. military naval presence in the Black Sea. Again, I wish that there were, but